Good morning. Those people who find themselves in situations by life circumstances or by their psychological or physical or emotional disability or ability, or the situations of life that are thrown up at them, where they can speak out or invited or in the place where they can speak out for what is true or right or just. People who maybe are whistleblowers in corporations or governments. People who have this particular place, space, where they're able to speak out for what is true and right and just and loving, often find themselves in a precarious situation. They may be initially received, but when the seriousness of what they're saying, particularly as it pushes against the status quo or the powerful or the wealthy or the privileged, they will be rejected. And their message will be rejected. They'll be persecuted or mocked, or in any way their message can be resisted, rejected. I read just recently stories of statisticians, written by an economic statistician who describes his land, the world he inhabits, as Nerdland, where there's this particular fascination and interest in numbers, in gathering data and processing the numbers and churning out the results, to make them as accurate and as meaningful as possible, to help people in make economic decisions or justice decisions or decisions about the world in which we live in some way. They gather census data, economic data, all sorts of data. And he was talking about a particular statistician who worked for the International Monetary Fund in Washington DC for a couple of decades, who had enormous experience and expertise and was highly regarded. He was invited by his homeland, Greece, to go back and set up a statistical bureau, a unit, an independent unit, to bring up to date and up to scratch the statistics of Greece. At the time he started, there was a global financial crisis, and Greece was part of the European Economic Community, the EEC, and as part of that, they had to commit to having no more than 3% of their gross domestic income allocated to the deficit, to borrowings, to borrowing between what they spend and what they received in income. For many years, Greece had underwritten that value, the true value. They'd found creative ways of bookkeeping, where one year they just forgot to include all the data associated with the health, hospitals and so forth that they were rebuilding or financing, so it made it look better. When Andreas Georgiou came to set up this unit, to apply his expertise to it, he crunched the numbers. By then, the somewhat low figure of 3.7% that the authorities had been saying their deficit had been increased to about 13.5%, an impossibly large and unwieldy number in the context of their economy. When Andreas Georgiou crunched his numbers, it came out even higher at 15.5%. An impossibly large number. Something that had serious implications. The authorities didn't like his number. They didn't like what he was doing. And so they brought charges against him, persecuting him. Charges that accused him of falsifying information to embarrass Greece and that would bring the economy down. He was taken to court, charged with a number of offences which would require a lifetime of sentences to fulfil. The charges were thrown out. They were brought and thrown out 6 times. Andreas stayed for 5 years and established that department as best he could. But I guess the damage had been done. He had experienced the persecution and the kickback and the fighting back. Although he had never gone to prison and doesn't look like he will, other statisticians who come in his place know what they're in for if their numbers don't accord with what the authorities want. An even worse situation in Argentina. Graciela Bavacqua was asked, another dignified statistician, was asked to set up a unit in Argentina. What they had could not be called a statistical unit in any shape or form. So she put all her expertise into it, she crunched the numbers, but she didn't come up with the numbers that the authorities wanted and expected. And so they challenged her and persecuted her, sent her off on leave, and when she came back she found she had no job, or that job she was sacked from, and she was demoted to be a librarian on a third of her salary. She quit. In both of these situations, the international statistical community had written submissions and letters in support of these two well-respected statisticians. In a bizarre situation in an unnamed country in Africa, the chief statistician was given a set of numbers that he had to find as true, or his children would be shot and killed. This is statistics. But in many other ways, people who speak out for truth and justice, for what is right and loving, are persecuted, put down. Martin Luther King Jr., when he formed and led that movement for civil rights in America, out of his gospel, out of his faith traditions that spoke of the equality of all people, even using the America's creeds that are all equal, he stood up for the equality of people, regardless of skin colour, regardless of background, that all were equal and should share a place of equality in their world. Many joined him, particularly those who were experiencing racism and marginalisation. Some of the privileged whiter community who benefited from racism joined him, saw the truth in what he said and stood with him. And those who stood in that movement were persecuted. There were threats and there was violence, and many were killed or imprisoned. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was murdered, assassinated, for speaking truth, for speaking out for justice, which is what love looks like when it's articulated in the world in action. These and many other stories from around the world demonstrate that when we stand up for truth, when we speak out for love and for justice and for equality, for what we might title, in Jesus' words, the reign of God. All these things that God seeks, all these things that are part of the reign of God in the world and what God is on about. There will be resistance from those who have power, those who have control. It's well known that Vladimir Putin, if you reject what he says or his ways or challenge him, you find yourself imprisoned or murdered. Donald Trump uses all kinds of mockery as he makes up numbers and figures, economics or unemployment or whatever they may be. When he's held to account, he mocks and abuses and resists and rejects the person or people. This is the way of much of our world. When Greta Thunberg stood up as a young teenager, concerned and a voice of her generation about the future of the world, the future that will be their world and their children's world, and spoke out about climate change and the stories she'd heard from climate scientists. When she spoke out, originally her words were received, and isn't she a cute teenager, and cute, articulate, isn't that wonderful? But when the seriousness of her words were accepted and received and cut in, those who would not benefit from changes, those whose industries or nations or economies might be affected if we took climate change seriously, stood against her, mocked her, and all sorts of comments have been made about her and putting her down. As they have with climate scientists, these people who have deep experience and wisdom and skill and training and expertise, who go about their work of gathering data, crunching the numbers and the photos and the images and the data that comes to them, and tell us what's happening, who warn us of the catastrophic conditions and circumstances of the future if we don't listen and do something now. But they're put down and pushed aside by those who have other interests, those whose money and jobs and economies are based around fossil fuels and those industries. When people speak the truth, or whistleblowing corporations, they're mocked, persecuted and put down. And in Matthew's story of Jesus, in chapter 10, he sent the disciples out into the world to proclaim this way of love and justice, this alternative way in the world. But he warns them that their message, whilst important, and the message of God and the way of God will not always be well received. And they need to be aware of that and ready for it. And as it goes on in this week's story, he says, those of you who have a voice, who find yourself in a place to speak out, you'll be blessed if you do. Martin Luther King Jr., on the night before he was assassinated, gave that speech. The speech that says, I've been to the promised land, I've looked in, and we will make it, we will get there, we will find equality, we'll work, it's going to happen. I know it. And he was filled with this sense of peace and grace and love and justice and hope. And he said, I want to live a long life, but I know that there are those who are resisting, who persecute, who threaten me. And I may not be there with you. But I want to tell you, I've seen the vision, and we're going to get it. We're going to make it. And the next day he was killed. But in a sense, his reward, he lived into the life that he was called to. He lived in with integrity and life, and he was given that deep sense of peace and satisfaction. Something to live and fight and work for. Something worth living and dying for. And he had it. And many others have too. And Jesus says, when you speak out, you will be rewarded. Not maybe in the material sense, and you won't get the gold stars or the accolades, but you'll know you've done the right thing. And you've spoken in the name of God. And if you receive those who speak out, if you listen to their voice and follow and walk with them, if you receive their words of truth and justice and love and life, you too will walk into that way. If you stand with Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, even though you experience the persecution they do, you know you've been doing the right thing. You're on the side of truth and justice and righteousness. You're on the side of God. And then he goes on, if you give even a glass of water to the little ones who come and are struggling with the truth, they're struggling to hold up the truth, who are marginalised and pushed to the sides, those who are little ones in our society, who their very cries are crying out for help, for change. If you give even a glass of water to them, you're standing with them on the side of truth and of love and of justice. And you'll be rewarded in that sense, in that way, of knowing that you're in the place of life. You're standing with God, with Christ, who stood with the most poor and marginalised and welcomed them into this community, this eternal community of God's grace and love. This inclusive community where all are equal and all find their place. That's what we're invited into. It's not the easy way, it's not the popular way, but it is the way of life. Amen.